Cynthia, thank you so much for that introduction and for kicking us off this afternoon. I couldn't be more excited to be sharing with all of you the last of our six-part series, Session 6, Creating Strategic Alliances. This Moving Beyond Triage series has been such a pleasure to share with all of you over the last 3 weeks. And I think that to close it out with a topic that I believe is only going to become more and more important as we look to navigate the crisis, but also recovery. Really excited to do a deep dive today. So welcome to all of you. For those of you that are new, that this might actually be your first webinar with us, we are FIO partners, and FIO is Latin for become. We are a consulting firm that's based in Connecticut and Rhode Island, but we do work around the country. You know, our purpose is to help leaders make better decisions, and we do that primarily through strategic planning, strategic alliances, as well as work with the foundations and the philanthropic community, as well as training and research. And so just really excited to be a support to all of you as nonprofit leaders as you really look to navigate the crisis. And so here we are. I cannot believe we're at session 6. I cannot believe that we've delivered 6 of these over the last 3 weeks. We've covered a lot of topics, and I think what I want to share with all of you on the line today, especially if this is your first webinar, is that all of the sessions have been recorded and are going to be available on our YouTube channel, which is also new. And so again, if you'd like to share this content with your board or with other stakeholders, it will be there for you to take a look at. So again, today is the 2 speakers today are myself and my wonderful esteemed colleague, Cynthia Rojas. We are really excited for this to be a conversation, as Cynthia has talked about. And so we're just really excited to be your partners in this journey today. And one of the things that we learned at our last session on Tuesday is that this is actually really fun. We've introduced ourselves to you, but we want to give you a chance to actually meet others that are on the call today. So what we're actually going to do is give you 2 or 3 minutes. We are going to break you up into breakout rooms. And I think, give me just 1 second. I'm going to do a stop share. And then what we'd like you to do, and I'm actually going to lean over to Cynthia or Melissa, because I actually, for some reason, don't have my breakout room tech. So I'm wondering who's got it. Which one?
I don't have it.
I'm going to see if Melissa is with us.
I don't either.
Oh, no. This is a travesty. Oh, I've got it. I apologize. That was me. I had it the whole time. It was just secret. There we go. All right. So what I'm going to do is break you into breakout rooms really quickly. And what I'd like to do, I'm going to give you just about 3 to 4 minutes to introduce yourself, your organization, and what is your pandemic bright spot for what actually is week 9. So I'm going to break you up, give you a couple of minutes, and then I'll bring you right back. So when you get prompted to join the breakout room, go ahead and do that. I hope you like getting a chance to introduce yourselves in the breakout rooms. It's always festive. And just as a reminder to everyone, you know, we run the webinar just about till 4:30, and then from 4:30 to 5, we do open discussion and encourage you to grab your favorite beverage of choice and stick around and chat with us. So we'll be on until 5 today, but I think we're ready to go. So really, in so many ways, what are we hoping to accomplish today? So this is about strategic alliances, and this is about discussing strategic alliances as a tool as we think about how do we amplify impact on the other side of the crisis. If there's another side, it's more like the continued crisis. But what I'm hoping to cover in the time today, and Cynthia and I are going to do this kind of as a conversation, which is really about what is a strategic alliance? What are some of the options available to you, and really how do you prepare as an organization to even consider embarking on a conversation which is really a strategic alliance with another party. I think it's important to know that I won't really be able to cover today some of the technical steps or sort of the negotiation process associated with a strategic alliance, but I really am happy to answer questions related to that. You know, if you kind of, as we're going through it in the chat box, want to drop in a question about something really specific and technical, you know, I may hold it till the end for the Q&A, but you know, this is really about preparation today. So this is more about preparation today than it is really about the mechanics. And I think in a lot of ways, it's an important recognition that this work, it's really hard to do a strategic alliance quickly. And so the preparation part is really one of the most important pieces. And so what are we going to do today? It's really, what is a strategic alliance? How do we take stock of our relationships? We'll talk a little bit about why the quality of your relationships is a real precursor to your ability to create a strategic alliance. And lastly, we'll anchor out with how can you prepare. So let's just jump right in with this. So one of the things that we've been really seeing in the crisis, and in some ways the discussions about how do we move forward, is really some banter amongst funders, amongst larger nonprofits that are like, well, there's a lot of nonprofits. And so if some nonprofits close, well, maybe that's okay. And I have to say, from my position as a capacity builder, I think that there's tremendous loss in the whole stock potential loss of small nonprofit organizations. Small nonprofits actually are, in so many ways, those closest to those in community to provide services. And if we lose our small nonprofits, we actually lose the ability to support those communities. And so when I think about each of you and I think about your consideration of a strategic alliance, every conversation that I have with a leader that says, I'm thinking about a strategic alliance, my first question is going to say, why? And my second question is how is it going to make your work better for your community? So every strategic alliance has to start with a conversation that says, how do we lead with the work? How do we lead with the impact that we want to have on the community that we serve? And that really has to be the starting point. And we're going to talk today about what does it mean to lead with the work. It really requires both an understanding of what you're trying to achieve and how a strategic alliance could help you achieve it. But that starting place still has to be your own clarity around the impact that you're trying to have. So for those of you that were able to plug into us last week when we talked about retrenchment, I shared this slide with you at that point. But it's really also important to understand that not only do we need to be clear about the work, we've got to be clear about our options, right? So who are we as an organization and how have we been impacted by the crisis? So have we figured out in some ways that we are financially vulnerable? If that's the case, we need to be thinking about a strategic alliance to protect our programming. If we figured out that we might actually be able to weather this storm, that we're going to make it out on the other side, that we're financially sustainable, I want you to begin to think about a leadership role. Are there other smaller organizations in your industry or geography that are at risk that you should be talking to because they actually will close? And when they close, they will take institutional knowledge, they will take community relationships, and they will take community trust with them. And the ability to rebuild that without the human capital in those smaller nonprofits is practically impossible. And so if you really are going to be okay in this, now is the time to lead and to think in fact about a strategic alliance that strengthens your programs and services. If you're not sure where to partner, but you think this is an interesting subject, part of this is to lean into your programs and services and really begin to understand, are there programs and services that could be augmented? Again, focusing on the work through possible alliances and partnerships. And lastly, if you're not sure about what the partnership or what it is, it really requires you to understand what the work is you're trying to do with the alliance. So there's a lot of options here. And so I think I'd love to hear, before I kind of go through the rest of the content, if the group really wants to kind of jump into the chat a little bit and sort of think a little bit about what brings you to this conversation. I'd love for us to kind of, as we're talking about what strategic alliances are, what about them are you interested in better understanding? Is this about that you're a little bit worried that you may not make it and you're seeking a partner? Is this about, I just generally want to understand this topic? Is it, no, actually, we're actively thinking about this? Give me some sense of kind of the intention that you're bringing today's conversation.
And while we're waiting, can I ask you this concept of central authority? We're going to see it throughout the slides.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that bullet point on the far right of your.
Yeah, happy to. And we will talk about this concept a few times as we go through the presentation. And when I want you to think about central authority, it's all about when we think about the work to do, how controlled does it have to be? So if you think about a program that you're going to do with a couple of other organizations, and I tend to use in some ways is like a voter registration. So let's do a quick example. So Cynthia's organization, my organization, Lisa Sanborn's organization, and Sarah Hall's organization decide to do a voter registration drive. I'm the larger entity, so I get the grant to run the program. All three of them are going to run voter registration drives. So I want to kind of ask the group, and you can kind of just say like high or low, how much control do I need over kind of what they do at their sites? So remember, it's voter registration. How much direction do I need to give them? How many rules do they need to follow? So if this is a voter registration kind of initiative, is it really loose? And I'm sort of like, hey, Sarah, you run that any way you want. You just you just do that voter registration, whatever forms you want to use is fine. Or is it more like, no, I actually need you to use these forms, do it this way, report your data. So Sarah's given me a high. So give me some, like, how much control do I need to have in terms of what my partners do? And that's what central authority is. So it's all about realizing that there are some bodies of work, and it's the work that always answers this question that tells us how much control we need. And so depending on the alliance, that will tell us how many agreements we need to have, how much training we might need, and how in some ways directive we might have to be with our potential partners. So it's not a term that people find really attractive. They're like, oh, let's talk about central authority. But that's actually what it is. And I think that's a great prompt to try to explain that a little.
Thank you.
Awesome. So I'm jumping into the chat a little bit here. So we've got people looking at partnerships, want to learn more. Partnership with the States Municipal League. Actively considering alliances prior, trying to pivot. Yep. Partners may be in a different place. How to make alliances sustainable in terms of coalitions and collaboratives. Absolutely. Sustainability, the backbone. Yeah, Sandra, that's huge, especially as we're doing so much collective impact work, and the funding models for that backbone support are limited. Agreed. We should definitely talk more about that. Great. All right. Well, I'm going to keep us moving because in a lot of ways, there's a bit to cover today. So we have to recognize that strategic alliances fall across a continuum, all the way from coordination to collaboration to consolidation. And what drives us across from one side to the other, and I want to keep reminding you, as nonprofit leaders, you are collaborating, coordinating all of the time. Think about the shared conference rooms. Think about the organization, the couple of organizations that come together to do an event, that you might share space, that you may share staff. Those of you that do human services work, you use MOUs to basically bring in pieces of a continuum of care to serve a particular family or at a particular site. We do this work all of the time. Sometimes organizations are really good at using agreements to capture these kind of relationships. But it's when money starts to increase and sophistication starts to increase that we move from verbal coordination to really collaboration and then actually consolidation. And consolidation is really where we are changing the legal links between organizations. And again, across this continuum, you see that range of increasing central authority and a reduction in autonomy. And so what I wanted to do is just kind of show you that, from my perspective, strategic alliances have 101 flavors. There's not one way to do this. I think it's one of the most creative tools for nonprofit leaders that they can use to really drive impact in new and different ways. And really the way you can put these together is really quite limitless. But in some ways, it's really a muscle and a capacity to build to understand how to use this tool really, really well to support impact. Any questions from the group about the continuum? Yeah. So when you kind of take the continuum, though, and you really lean in to kind of the right side of that spectrum, and so I think it's important to recognize that, for the rest of the presentation, I'm not really going to be talking about coordination. I'm not even really going to be talking about collaboration. And these are, in some ways, what I would say are early stage steps to work together with other organizations. This is what you do all the time. Um, what we're going to start to talk about is the kinds of alliances that really do require a more substantive agreement, like a partnership agreement or a more detailed MOU. And what happens when you start to increase the number of players, you start to increase the risk, and you increase the sophistication of the relationship. So this pyramid is really a consolidation continuum. And so at the bottom of this are really joint ventures and partnerships. And these are the kinds of relationships where a couple of nonprofits may actually come together to create and own a for-profit company together. There's a great example of that here in Connecticut. We have 3 human services nonprofits that needed electronic medical records. And so they actually started an electronic medical record company for themselves that they could also sell to other nonprofits. So there's some real creativity around joint ventures. Going up the pyramid, we then have management service organizations, and this is where nonprofits can actually share their back office, or you can purchase those back office services from someone else, and there's a few different ways to do that. But I know so many of you have financial management, HR, marketing, fund development. It's how do I actually bundle that, and either a set of nonprofits can actually take those functions and own them and run them together, or you can contract with a larger nonprofit. Moving our way up, then we have networks, and we can have networks and lots of different kinds of networks. Service delivery networks, we can have affiliation networks, we can have referral networks. We can also have coalitions and collaboratives that are geographically focused. So these are the types of organizations where we actually, the numbers tend to increase really quite substantially. You're going from 2 to 3 organizations, anywhere from 8 to 10 to 22. Or even higher. And so service delivery networks are ways in which people can state contract with a full network to deliver services like across the state. Best example of that in Connecticut is the Connecticut Family Service Agencies, the Association of Family Service Agencies. There's 9 of them across the state, and they actually will do statewide contracting for services for their populations. Mm. Continuing to move up that pyramid in sophistication is a parent corporation, and this is actually where one nonprofit becomes the subsidiary of a larger nonprofit. Great example of that here in Connecticut is Oak Hill and Gilead Services. They were separate entities, and now Gilead is in fact a subsidiary of Oak Hill. In a subsidiary model, it's very attractive. Nonprofits keep their name, they keep their board, but they actually basically come in under the umbrella of the larger entity. So they may give up their C3 status, and it's the larger C3 that is sometimes the organization. But in a lot of ways, what ends up happening is that it can be a step to what is the top of the pyramid, which is a full merger. And I think in a lot of cases, it's important to know that at the top of the pyramid is not only merger, but asset acquisition. And depending on your organization, it's really quite different as to why you would choose one or the other. Most of it has to do with the ability to transfer debt and whether or not debt can be transferred. So if debt can't be transferred to an alternate party in a merger, you're more likely to see an asset acquisition. Whereas with a merger, all debts and liabilities of the prior nonprofit get basically merged into a remaining nonprofit. So for organizations that have had liability, I was involved in a merger between a farm and a nonprofit, and the farm actually had pollution in like 30 years ago, so there were lots of sort of agreements that need to be made about that. But part of it is realizing that when you merge, you're really merging, like you're moving in, you're bringing all the baggage along with that. So, you know, what's important to realize is that this is a continuum, and that there's kind of a method here in terms of trying to figure out, you know, what is it that you're doing in the partnership. But it also comes back around to what's the work and what's the desired impact of the combination.
One of the things I liked about this slide was this idea of a lot of us tend to go straight into thinking about merging and losing our identity, and that there are all these options where you can still, as a nonprofit, keep your identity, but relieve some of the burden of running a nonprofit independently. So I thought this was a really good slide, especially the parent corporation or the MSO.
Yep.
Felt like a really good place for some nonprofits who still want to operate the way they do.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I think we're really working on with clients when we sort of teach this material is that a merger is not a failure, right? So oftentimes we'll be like, well, if we're merging, clearly we failed. And our message is, if you've chosen merger as the resulting kind of discussion, of feasibility, of understanding the circumstances, it's one of those combinations that really allows you to protect typically a substantive amount of the staff, a substantive amount of the programming. And it really is in some ways trying to find the deep mutual benefit between two entities. And it is really combining them. And so I think in a lot of ways people think a merger is, oh, we're giving up, or it's, the end of days. And it's really like, no, oftentimes a merger is the fastest and best way to protect the work. And I think that we've all got, as nonprofit leaders, to help build muscles around the boardroom table and amongst us as CEOs to be able to convey that a merger is in fact sometimes the best strategy to protect the work. It's not a failure. And that's a tough road to hoe, I think, but I think it's one we all need to kind of think about.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So I'd love to hear from you in the chat. Just what are some examples of nonprofit alliances that you've seen that you think in some ways represent kind of why you're curious about this, or why you think that strategic alliances may be a good idea? Are there examples for you that come to mind where we've really seen some success in nonprofit partnerships? And this is the tricky part of this presentation, in the sense of, if there are no good examples, like, I'm on it, but I'm really curious to see if you guys have seen some that you're aware of, because sometimes people don't really know about them. Dorcas International Institute. Thank you, Brent, jumping in.
We can unmute. Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Hey, Brent, could you tell?
Well, you're muted, Anne, so.
Oh.
Brent, tell us about Dorcas.
So I know the director, so I know a little bit, but it was two organizations, one that did mostly like English language learning.
Mm-hmm.
And they had like they had profitable profit centers where they were doing translation. And then the other one was refugee settlement.
Yep.
They've been around for a long time. So they went through a merger. I don't recall why, but they merged the names, they merged the mission. And I think it worked out really well because they were basically serving the same kind of populations.
Exactly. And so it's all about mutual benefit. It's all about where we see services aligned. We've done a couple of mergers over the last year here in Connecticut that I can share. One of them is Lisa Inc. and CSI. Lisa Inc. was a small human services organization serving at-risk youth, and CSI was a much larger entity, substantive human services with a focus on adults. Really was able to bring them together due to both their mutual interest in learning from one another, but also really to allow Lisa Inc.'s programming to potentially scale even greater. CSI is actually a national organization, so they were excited to bring CSI's programming, Lisa Inc.'s programming, actually potentially across the country. And another combination was the New Haven Farms and the New Haven Land Trust recently came together and have become Gather New Haven, given their alignment around community farms, as well as urban agriculture. So I think a lot of this is what you see is common interests, mutual benefits, similar programming. It's kind of like bringing the best of both worlds together. And Jennifer just comments by saying, the idea's been tossed around a little bit, but it's really about greater alignment. And I think really when we see duplication of services or very similar services, that's really where there's the most opportunity.
I also had lived through an acquisition. It was a partnership where one organization became the parent.
Yeah.
And the other one was the subsidiary. And one of the things I really appreciated was, one, we were able to create tons of efficiencies.
Yeah.
But the identity remained with each organization and the culture. So we both have very different organizational cultures. Mm-hmm. And I probably shouldn't say very, but we did have different organizational cultures. And they and we were able to keep them and still partner in a way that I thought was extremely respectful,
Yeah.
and we were able to learn from them. So even though we were the parent corporation, we
Mhm.
also had a stand of, we're going to learn from you as well. So it was a really great experience.
And I really think, the really good news is I think we do have stories. We have success stories of nonprofits coming together, to your point, Cynthia, in a really mutually respectful way that acknowledges the strengths of both organizations and really pushes to say, what's the right structure for this combination? When culture is really different, we want to see you want to see it separate, because putting those cultures together may have been really challenging and may have made the alliance even that much more difficult. And so where we kind of can understand that in the feasibility work before we even engage in the actual coming together, that gives us those red flags about what could be a problem.
Right.
But I really do think that's why I think understanding the structures is so important, because I think you can have a different outcome if you choose a different structure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's kind of begin to shift gears a little bit and talk about your relationships. And so one of the things that I believe is the strongest precursor to a strategic alliance is really understanding who is a potential partner. So how do we do this? The key is to actually really map your current relationships. I'd love to say that all of you are, between navel gazing and gardening, have all this free time on your hands. You don't. But if this is a priority for you, part of this is actually taking, as we have talked in many of our webinars, like an intentional process, right? So we've got to start with what's that ecosystem of relationships that we maintain. And when we're thinking about that, it's how strong are those relationships? What's the level of trust in those relationships? And I'll talk a little bit more about why trust is so important in these conversations. But the first thing to do is actually to create that ecosystem. It's your partners, it's your peers, it may even be your competitors. We have to acknowledge that there is competition in the nonprofit sector. You compete for dollars, you compete for clients. And it's important to know who your competitors are. They may actually be potential strategic alliance partners as we think about scale and we think about scaling and the opportunity to potentially garner greater resources. Sometimes your competitors can actually be your best partners. So you've got to take stock of that, and you've got to really begin to kind of track the last time you talked to these people. So it's not just mapping the relationships, it's realizing that relationships take cultivation. And so you've got to kind of actually figure out who's been maintaining this relationship in your organization, when was the last time we talked to them, and how are they doing in the crisis, right? So it's sort of really that check-in and really mapping the quality of the relationships that you've cultivated thus far.
What if you don't have a relationship but
Yeah,
you know of the organization?
right.
Is it a cold call?
It can be a cold call. When I usually have more time to train on this topic, I at least have one slide with a cup of coffee on it, because I really think that the cold call is possible. I think it is about a cup of coffee though, and if need be, you need a virtual like diner behind your back these days. But I do think that if it's a cold call and you really think this is a potential partner, it is picking up the phone and saying, I've
Mhm.
heard a lot about your organization. I would just like to share with you about our organization. How are you faring? I'd like to share how we're faring. Here's what's on our mind. I do think, though, that early stage positioning is really important. And sometimes, be thoughtful about what you share in early stage discussions in terms of what you're trying to achieve, right? And so I do think you've got to, as much as it's a cold call, we're going to talk before we finish this afternoon about what I want you to think about before you pick up the phone, right? So if we're going to pick up the phone and do a cold call, we've really got to know why. We've got to know, why do we have to go to a cold relationship where none of our other more cultivated, warm relationships are possible?
Mm.
And that's really, I think, a good question to kind of push yourself on is, does it have to be a cold call? Sometimes it might need to be.
Mhm.
Yeah, but let's lean into that as we move into preparation. So we do need to really recognize the importance of trust. So we live in New England, and for those of you that may be plugging in from elsewhere, this may be true where you live as well, but in New England, no one forgets anything ever. So it could be like 15 to 20 years like ago, and you'll be saying, oh, I really think we should talk with that organization. And a board member will be like, no, 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 no. Back in 1982, we talked to them and it didn't go well, so we can never talk to them again. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. because it's not true. It's probably not accurate. But what it also does is it undermines trust, right? So these relationships are fundamentally built between human beings. It takes two people, it takes intentional, engaged board members to make these deals happen. And so we've got to think about building trust from the very first point of communication all the way through the process. So how do we build trust? The first piece is really around disclosure and communication. Do I actually trust that what you say is accurate? Another piece of trust is around character. Do you actually follow through? Are you accountable? And the last one is also about competence. So when you say that you can do something, do you actually do it? And the thing about trust is that it gets built over time. And if there are missteps, it takes time to rebuild. So we've got to acknowledge that every organization, particularly here in New England, like has a long memory. So where trust has been broken, we've got to rebuild it, and we've got to be intentional, particularly on those relationships that we've identified as a priority of actually cultivating trust over time. And sometimes in possible strategic alliance relationship, doing something small together is sometimes a really good way to test out a partner, to figure out if you can trust each other, particularly if it's a new partner. But this has to be about the importance of relationship. Because you won't be able to get through the hard parts of a negotiation if the trust isn't there from really the first day.
I just want to add that we got a couple of comments related to the New England issue of taking a lifetime to forgive and forget. So apparently this also happens in Eastern Canada. Melissa mentioned her organization is 57 years old, so she probably has 57 years of history that she could probably talk to. So it's not just endemic in New England. Apparently others have the same issue. That's comforting, I think.
I think it's a little comforting. Maybe it just really reinforces this slide. Hey, Brent, you want to jump in?
Yeah, let me.
Yeah, 66 years. No, I guess whenever I bring this up, because I talk with our statewide preservation organization, we're the local, they're the statewide, and we're a small state. So why do we need both? But we both think it's a good idea. But since our organization's in a stronger position, my board thinks there's no point. Like, why bother if you're in a stronger position? So I have yet to make that case. So.
Well, I think part of it is thinking about, there's real innovation here, Brent, in envisioning these relationships. And so if you're the stronger partner, it's really trying to understand, and we're going to get to this today, but your own internal clarity as to your why. That's where we build board alignment, right? So we've got to be clear about why we would engage any partner in a particular conversation. I think a lot about the fact that in some systems, there are not natural leaders, or those that should be the natural leaders are not. And so sometimes when we think about alliances where people are kind of hesitant, I try to encourage also system thinking, like what does the entire system look like, and how at risk is the whole system? Because that's actually where I think leaders can emerge, when we actually see that our system may not survive this crisis, or that our system actually is going to lose a substantive number of players. And so I think the crisis is actually going to change the conversation around strategic alliances. And I think it's going to happen actually pretty quickly. So Brent, you may be able to get a little more traction on this issue over the next few months. All right, so how do we prepare? So I'm keeping an eye on the time. Wanted to make sure I kind of get to these pieces. So how do we get ready to do this? So we've talked a lot about relationships. We've talked about trust. Every presentation should have a llama in it. So this is to be prepared to engage. So when we think about going on a hiking trip like this llama, we're packing our water, we're putting our backpack on, we're feeding our llama, we're getting ready to go. And my message here around strategic alliances, do not go until you're ready. What often happens is that parties go to the table and they're not ready, which means that conversations don't really go anywhere. People sort of say, well, we should do something together. Let's have lunch in a few weeks. And then They have lunch and the food's really good. And then a couple weeks go by, we're like, we should get back to doing that thing that we said we'd do together. You've got to actually really be pretty intentional about this. You've got to know what you're hoping to achieve, and you've got to know why you're talking to this person. Why are you talking to this organization? What conclusions have you drawn from what your basically position is and what you think their position is? But if we're not prepared ourselves, these conversations are really circular. And so what does that mean? So the first thing we have to really think about is, how does the strategic alliance fit with our own strategic direction? If you can do an environmental scan, if you can think about your relationships, and we're going to give you a handout in a second as well that I think will be helpful with some of this, but your why could really be about, we want to draw additional program competencies to our work. We've looked at our programs. We need to add an arts element, or we need to add in, more representation from this community. So we want to do an alliance that makes our programming better, or we are actually vulnerable and we need to protect our programming. This is why we need to find an alliance or a partner. In other cases, people want to do alliances to actually expand their footprint, or to attract additional resources to achieve a desired goal. And that's really about scale. And that's where I think about sort of systems and industries where coming together into a network or coming together in a collective can actually draw additional resources into a system. So we've got to be clear. We've got to also, in so many ways, really understand how this relationship, the one that we've honed in on, is the right one to invest more time into. Oftentimes for clients, they will know that they need to merge, but they actually don't know with who. So we will actually support them with what I call I won't say that we're the Tinder for nonprofits, but I will say that what we try and do is lean into what one organization is trying to achieve, lean into their current relationships, and really narrow down that list. And in some ways narrowed it down to the 2, 3, or 4 organizations that really could be potential partners. And then support them with early stage due diligence and actually picking the partner that they actually want to kind of invite into a deeper, more formal conversation. There's got to be a fit with your own strengths and weaknesses. And there's really got to be a commitment at both the CEO and board level that this is worth their time. These things do not get built overnight. This actually takes the time and energy of the CEO and board members to really invest in it. And you've got to really, in so many ways, be clear about your own why. So let's talk about how to do that. How do we get even more clear? So I'm going to ask Melissa from our team to share a quick handout that I think is really helpful for board members and you as CEOs to get more clear about the why that you'll do this. And so what's included in this, and Cynthia, just let me know when is Melissa able to share that?
It's in the chat.
Fantastic. So what you've got in the chat is a handout that really just has 2 pieces. The first is key preparatory questions for board members. So these are questions that you can engage your board around. How will the environment change around us? How will those changes change the expectations of our organization? What will be affected? And why would we be considering an alliance or in a collaborative venture? And lastly, it's really all about being clear about why we actually need to do this with another organization versus working alone. And actually taking a board through this set of questions can build the buy-in for the why that a strategic alliance would make sense. And then the second handout really actually supports you in developing a policy at the board level. And that in some ways is really helpful as you're considering options or options are coming to you and you want to be clear with your board about how they're going to be handled. And again, it's not meant to be overly prescriptive, but just gives you this guide that says that the other way strategic alliances sometimes happen is kind of in a really off the rails kind of way, which is when you've got 2 board members at a cocktail party who say, I really think our organizations should merge. And then literally, who knows what will happen next. So the response policy is really helpful for that in terms of getting agreement around what are the steps that you're going to take in so many ways should an opportunity cross your path. So the closing message here in this conversation today is that this is really about an intentional process. It's led by leaders that are engaged, informed, and willing to work together to really envision the future of the organization and why a strategic alliance really will make sense. But what I want to do now, just kind of with the interest of time, is just kind of open this up for Q&A.
And you can unmute yourself if you want
Yeah,
to
we're a
ask
small
a
group.
question instead of.
Questions that folks may have. Hopefully that's helpful. I mean, I think this is a pretty complex topic to try to teach in 30 minutes or 35. So I tried to hit the highlights, the sort of things to think about between what are some of the models, how you can prepare and begin to think about this. But there certainly are a lot of other aspects to kind of bringing these combinations to fruition. But I'm happy to really answer any questions that people might have, or kind of specific questions that you may have brought to today's session.
While people are thinking, I have one that's been in my head since the beginning of the presentation, and maybe it's two parts. One is trust. So if you know the potential partner, that's easier. But what are some really easy, simple things you can do to build trust, especially with someone who doesn't know you? And then I want to ask the second part because it might be related. Is it a warning sign when the quote unquote merger or the one that's doing the absorbing starts to behave in a way that exerts their authority, and the one who's being absorbed starts to feel it very early on? Is that a warning sign, or is that an opportunity for a conversation and maybe a reset?
Yeah, so two really different questions. So let me start with the first one. So the first one really is in terms of practical things that we can do to build trust with new partners. The best advice I can give is to do something small. So create the opportunity to engage that new partner to undertake a small initiative. I promise you, you will learn an enormous amount about people just sort of saying, hey, could we possibly just have a conversation? Or would you be interested in partnering in this program? Or we're thinking about this, and inviting them to come to some meetings. And the reality is, if people don't show up to your meeting, if they don't respond, if they come late to the meeting, that tells you a lot about, is this person a potential trustworthy partner? And I know some of you may be thinking I'm reading the tea leaves on this, but I promise you that, you know, culture, organizational characteristics like are really present amongst many players in an organization. It typically runs the gamut around CEOs and board members, but if someone shows that they are not showing you either respect or trust early on, that is absolutely a red flag. So I think creating small, low risk ways to partner for early stage partners, great way to test people out. And then the second question is really a much bigger one, which is really about, once you've chosen a partner, once you're actually either being the acquired organization or in the midst of a merger, how does power play out? And I think it's really important to recognize that that sense of power is going to be present no matter what. The question becomes is, can you anchor back into what's good for your clients and what's good for your community? So even if the potential partner signals what I would say sort of like power over dynamics, if you can still anchor in the fact that this combination is better for your staff, better for your clients, and better for your community, what you're experiencing is just really natural, but it actually shouldn't preclude you from doing the combination. So it all comes back to the why are you combining? What is the desired objective of the combination? You know, we're seeing, in fact, in quite a number of combinations where we're seeing $50 or $60 million organizations look to acquire nonprofits that are somewhere between 4 and 6 million. And when you're a $60 million nonprofit, you have internal legal counsel and you do acquisitions. You don't do mergers. And I will tell you, they feel really, really, really different than what we would say is the combination of a $2 million nonprofit and a $2 million nonprofit. So we've got to recognize that those dynamics exist, and it's how do you ensure, even in that acquisition negotiation, that the needs of that smaller nonprofit are still being raised up and addressed. But the power over dynamics are going to be present, and there's not a lot you can do about it. If in some ways the organization has decided this is what's best for its clients And that's what I sort of keep trying to come back to, because that power stuff is stomach churning. But in some ways, if it's the right thing for the clients and you can anchor around that, you get a little more comfortable with those power pieces. But I've got a couple of other consultants on the line that might actually have a thought on that as well. But other questions that people might have brought to the call today? Awesome. All right. Well, I hope today was helpful. I'm going to just briefly bring us back to the slides real quick, just to close this out for today's session. We could not be more excited with the series. And today is actually our last session. So I just want to thank all of you. There's a few folks on the phone who've been with us, I think, for everyone. And if I had certificates, I would give them out to you today. But we are going to do a follow-up survey. And I think our team, you know, we are going to be on the line for another half hour or so after this. And we just would love to hear from you about kind of other things you're interested in, other topics that you'd like us to cover. We really are thinking as a team over the next couple of weeks of what else do we launch to support nonprofit leaders and CEOs as we look to this summer. And your feedback and perspectives are really welcome. So, but what you thought worked well, what you thought could be improved upon, we would really love to hear from you. So this is not goodbye. I think it's kind of like see you soon. For those of you that want to hang out with us, we will be on the line till 5. But I just really want to thank everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Ben, I'm not sure, closing comments? Awesome, great. Yeah, so thank you so much for coming, and we'll head over to the open session.